In the winter of 1968, while most of the city slept under sleet and sodium light, a demolition foreman stood in the belly of an old hotel and hit a wall that should not have existed. His name was Daniel Voss, 46 years old, Army veteran, concrete lungs, the kind of man who trusted load charts, steel fatigue, and what his flashlight showed him. Not rumors, not ghost stories, not old wise tales from bartenders who liked to say the city had another city under it. The building was the Wexler Hotel, a once grand brick landmark near the old commercial district. By then, it was dying. The ballroom had been stripped, the chandeliers were gone. Rain bled through the upper plaster. The city had signed off on demolition. According to the official paperwork, the hotel had 12 above-ground floors, 1 basement, and a boiler level below that. Nothing more. That was the official story. But on the third night of interior clearing, Voss and 2 laborers broke through a service corridor behind the boiler room and found a row of bricked-in window arches stretching along a wall no blueprint mentioned. Windows. Underground. Not small vents, not coal chutes, full window frames, tall enough for a man to stand beside. Their tops were arched. Their brickwork was older than the surrounding concrete, and behind the mortar, Voss swore he felt cold air moving. He told the men to stop joking around. He checked the plans again. Boiler room, pipe chase, foundation wall, end of story. But there was no foundation wall in the world that came with decorative lintels, brass sash locks, and the remains of velvet curtain rods. So he took a hammer himself, hit the first bricked arch, and watched old mortar split open like dried bone. What waited behind it was not soil pressed against the hotel's outer wall. It was darkness, open space, and somewhere beyond that darkness, another wall across what looked like a street. That is the part he repeated years later with the same expression every time. Not fear exactly, not even shock, more like the look of a man who had spent his whole life standing on the wrong floor and had only just realized it. Because what Voss said he saw that night was not a basement. It was a lower level of the city. A buried exterior, storefront glass under dust, building fronts cut off at the second story, lamp brackets sealed in brick, steps leading upward to nowhere, and along the hotel's hidden side, a run of windows that had once looked out onto open air before someone packed them shut and built a new street above them. If that sounds impossible, good. It sounded impossible to him, too. And yet he kept talking about one detail that made it worse. The windows had been covered from the inside first, as if whoever sealed that floor had not just buried it, they had wanted no one looking out. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what kind of place the Wexler had been before it became rubble. Built in the 1880s, expanded twice before the First World War, and remodeled after a fire that supposedly modernized the lower service wings, the hotel sat in one of those old downtown blocks where history stacked on itself faster than records could keep up. Maps changed, street grades changed, sewer lines were rerouted, entire alleys vanished from revised survey sheets. Officially, this was normal urban growth. Cities rose, foundations sank, roads were leveled, retaining walls were added. Nothing mysterious about that. But old cities do not just rise by accident. Someone raises them. Someone decides what gets filled, what gets hidden, and what gets forgotten. Voss was not a historian. He was there to take a dead building apart in safe sequence. Yet, within hours of the first breakthrough, he started noticing things that did not match the approved structure. There were door headers below the known basement level, cast iron columns with older foundry marks, a tiled corridor whose floor sat several feet below the hotel's own original service slab. Not rubble dumped into a cavity, not random debris, finished space. And then there was the dust. He said it laid differently down there,
Not like demolition powder, not like collapsed plaster. It was layered, settled, old. The kind of dust that gathers in places closed for a very long time and left undisturbed because no one is supposed to know they still exist. The men with him, Eddie Harrow and Luis Bentez, later gave conflicting accounts of what happened next. One said they found an old service annex. The other said they found a whole buried face of the block. Both agreed on one thing. There were windows, and those windows did not belong underground. By dawn, Voss had ordered flood lamps brought in. That was when the first credibility layer appeared. Set into the buried wall beyond the bricked arches was painted lettering, faint but legible under grime. Weston Mercantile. Not part of the hotel, not even the same era of construction by the look of it. A separate commercial frontage sitting lower than the known street and running parallel to the hidden windows. In other words, the hotel had once looked out onto an active street level that no longer officially existed. Voss did what practical men do when reality starts slipping. He reached for paperwork, permit files, renovation records, utility diagrams. He wanted a reason. Maybe the city had regraded the district after a flood. Maybe a retaining wall had enclosed an old service lane. Maybe this was a loading tunnel. But when he requested the older plans, pages were missing. Not damaged, missing. One file contained a neat typed note that read, "Revised lower access omitted after municipal elevation works." No drawings attached, no author's signature, just a sentence where explanation should have been. And that sentence should have reassured him. Instead, it pulled him deeper. Because if the lower access had merely been obsolete, why brick over full windows from the inside? Why remove references from later plans? Why treat an exterior-facing floor as if it never existed at all? That's when the demolition foreman stopped feeling like he was dismantling a hotel and started feeling like he had opened a lid.
The more they cleared, the stranger the geometry became. Behind the broken window arches was a narrow void, then a drop to a buried pavement surface. Voss described old stone curbing half swallowed by compacted fill. He found a rusted drain grate, still framed in place. He found the remains of a sign bracket bolted into masonry at shoulder height, which made no sense if the area had ever been meant as a cellar. And he found soot lines on the wall several feet above the hidden pavement, suggesting that this lower exterior had once stood open to smoke, weather, and street traffic. A basement does not weather from the side. A sealed utility court does not come with retail signage. And a forgotten service level does not usually have lace curtain hooks. That last detail came from Voss's taped testimony years later. He said one of the bricked windows still held a fragment of fabric, dry as paper, trapped behind a corroded latch. He kept returning to that image, a curtain, in a window underground, which meant that at some point in the past, someone had stood in that room, looked out through glass into daylight, and then disappeared from the official shape of the city. So what happened? This is where the record gets darker. A week after the discovery, according to one retired city clerk interviewed decades later, a municipal inspector arrived early, walked the lower site for less than 20 minutes, then ordered the area restricted. No photographers, no press, no outside contractors. The stated reason was structural instability, yet demolition above ground continued. That alone might not mean much. Dangerous discoveries get sealed all the time. But Voss claimed the inspector asked one question before anything else. How many windows did you open? Not what did you find, not is anyone hurt, not is the wall bearing load. How many windows did you open? Why ask that unless the windows mattered more than the structure? Then came the journal. Not some leather-bound relic from a movie, just a stained pocket notebook found in a metal locker in the lower corridor behind the hotel wall. Most of it was ruined, but a few lines survived,
written by what appears to have been a maintenance supervisor during the 1930s renovations. He wrote of the old street side and orders to close every visible opening before the pour. He mentioned complaints from workers about seeing fronts below grade farther than expected, and on one half-torn page he wrote a sentence that should have been impossible if this was merely a basement alteration. Guests in lower east rooms uneasy after hearing cart noise where no street remains. Read that again. Cart noise where no street remains. Either the man was inventing things, or even after the area was supposedly buried, something down there still sounded alive. Voss later said that line bothered him more than anything else, because during the third night, before the flood lamps were set, one of the laborers heard what he called iron rolling somewhere out in the dark. Everyone laughed about it afterward. No one admitted it twice. And still the evidence field kept building. Old insurance maps hinted at earlier grade lines. Newspaper fragments referenced sub-level facades after urban improvements. A local historian privately told Voss that several nearby blocks had rumors attached to them, stories of businesses whose first floors became basements after a sudden period of civic rebuilding no one could explain cleanly. At first, it sounded like normal city evolution. Then, a harder question formed. If this was ordinary, why did every trail go soft just as it reached the moment the city changed level?
That question is where a strange discovery becomes a pattern, because the Wexler was not alone. Once Voss started asking around, he heard the same kind of story from different cities, different trades, different decades. Bricked windows below sidewalks, full doorways in foundations, staircases descending to sealed landings, storefronts hidden beneath newer street grades, blocks where the basement level carried architectural detail too expensive for a service space. Everywhere the same feeling. Something once stood in the open and was later swallowed, normalized, and relabeled. Officially, there are always explanations. Flood mitigation, grade correction, transit expansion, modernization after fire, sanitation projects, urban renewal. And to be fair, sometimes those explanations are true. Cities do build over themselves. History sinks beneath asphalt all the time. But Voss believed the official story failed in one important way. It explained the engineering, not the secrecy. Because if the lower hotel floor had simply become obsolete, there would be plans, photographs, municipal notices, and public memory. Instead, there were missing pages, restricted access, and men in hard hats being told to stop opening windows. And that is where his private theory turned into something much bigger. He began to suspect the city had not gradually forgotten that lower world. It had actively edited it. Think about the psychology of bricking a window from the inside. That is not just closure, that is denial. It is one thing to bury a damaged district under fill and build above it. It is another to conceal every point of view from within, to erase the line between the people who once occupied those rooms and the world they looked out onto. What were they not supposed to see? Or, more dangerously, what were later generations not supposed to realize? In the years after demolition, Voss kept one copied survey fragment from the site. On it, beneath newer notation, were faint earlier marks suggesting an older street line nearly 12 feet lower than the present grade. 12 feet is not decorative fill. That is a swallowed first story. In some places, almost 2. Now widen the frame. How many old hotels, stations, courthouses, warehouses, and theaters carry basement windows that make no architectural sense? How many urban legends about tunnel systems are really memories of former street levels? How many foundation anomalies are actually the visible edge of a buried city phase, treated as too inconvenient, too costly, or too unsettling to explain honestly? And why do witness accounts keep clustering around workers, guards, janitors, firemen, demolition crews, and utility crews? Because those are the people who enter the places the public never sees.
They are the last witnesses, not scholars in archives, not politicians at podiums, men with pry bars, women with key rings, boiler techs, elevator operators, night porters, records clerks. The people who find the wrong wall, the extra stair, the sealed opening, the room that still has wallpaper where a foundation should be. Voss was one of them, which is why his story ends where so many of these stories do, not with a grand revelation, but quiet pressure. He said he was told, politely, to stop discussing the lower site if he wanted future contracts. No threats, no dramatic black cars, just doors closing, calls not returned, a reputation turning difficult, the oldest method in the world. Make the witness feel expensive, make silence practical. And over time, that works. Until one witness becomes old, has nothing left to lose, and starts talking anyway.
Late in life, Voss gave a recorded interview in a small apartment filled with city maps, cracked mugs, and cardboard boxes of copied documents. His hands shook. His voice did not. He said the most important thing about the hidden lower hotel floor was not that it existed, it was that it had been finished for people. That matters more than any wild theory, because finished space tells you intent, it tells you scale, it tells you this was not a drainage chamber, not a void, not a one-off construction oddity. It was occupied architecture, designed to be seen, entered, and used in public view. And if an entire public-facing level was later hidden, then someone buried more than brick. They buried memory. This is where the civilizational implication begins to press against the walls. Because once you accept that one visible city layer can be erased and recoded as basement, you start wondering how often historical continuity is manufactured after the fact, not necessarily through one giant conspiracy, sometimes through bureaucracy, embarrassment, cost, disaster response, and deliberate simplification. A city changes fast, records lag behind, and the official version hardens around whatever is easiest to teach. But easier is not the same as true. What if whole urban episodes were compressed into footnotes because they complicated the cleaner story of progress? What if buried streets, sealed facades, and hidden lower rooms are not isolated curiosities, but the surviving edges of events larger than we are allowed to picture clearly? Fires, floods, forced rebuilds, population movement, structural damage no one wanted fully described. Episodes where the fastest way forward was to raise the ground, rename the lower world, and move on. And if that happened once, it may have happened many times. Voss believed the Wexler site proved one more disturbing idea. He thought the hidden level had not been buried all at once. He thought parts of it remained accessible during transition, known to workers in certain departments, then slowly sealed in phases as the newer city consolidated above it. That would explain the interior bricking, the maintenance notes, the sounds reported from below, the piecemeal revisions. In other words, there may have been a period when two city levels coexisted, one public, one fading, one celebrated, one being covered. Imagine that for a moment. Guests checking into a fine hotel while below the accepted street line, remnants of an older urban frontage still sat in darkness, half accessible, half denied. Rooms above occupied by travelers, rooms below facing a dead exterior no brochure would mention. And behind those bricked windows, perhaps not just dust, but evidence of a transition nobody later wanted examined too closely. When Voss was asked what he believed he had truly opened, he paused a long time and said, "Not a basement, a mistake in the story." That line survived because it is bigger than one hotel. A mistake in the story. Maybe that is what so many buried places really are. Not lost worlds, not fantasy kingdoms, not proof of every theory people throw at them, just
hard physical interruptions in the official narrative, places where the clean timeline snags on masonry and old glass and refuses to pass smoothly. And sometimes that is even more dangerous, because once a wall proves the story is incomplete, people start looking for the rest.
The Wexler Hotel is gone now. Parking structure, fresh concrete, bright lines, no plaque for the lower windows, no mention of the buried street side, no public marker saying that a demolition foreman once opened a wall and found a view into a city-level history had pushed underground. That is how these things disappear. Not with flames, not always with force, sometimes with paperwork, resurfacing, and time. Daniel Voss died believing that what he saw under the hotel was part of a much older pattern hiding in plain sight across the built world, not ancient in the mythic sense, worse than that, recent enough that records should exist, human enough that someone made choices, close enough that the evidence still sits under our feet, just below the level where official memory begins. And maybe that is why stories like his linger, because they do not ask you to believe in magic. They ask you to believe in brick, in buried windows, in missing pages, in the strange silence that falls whenever ordinary workers uncover something that does not fit the authorized shape of the past. So the next time you walk an old downtown block and notice a basement window too elegant for a cellar, or a half-swallowed arch beneath a sidewalk grate, or a building whose first floor feels one story too low, ask yourself a simple question. Was this place built this way, or was it made to look this way after something was hidden? That is the line the story never wants you to cross, because once you do, every city becomes a layered confession. Every sealed opening becomes a sentence cut out of the record. Every demolition becomes a race between discovery and disposal. And somewhere in that race, men like Voss become the last honest eyes on things the modern surface was never meant to remember. If you are the kind of person who still pays attention to the details other people step over, stay close to this channel, because the buried past rarely announces itself with a headline. It leaks through cracks, it waits behind false walls, it survives in the testimony of the last worker, the last guard, the last witness who saw the wrong floor before it was sealed again. Most people will hear stories like this and dismiss them, but a few will recognize the pattern, and once you see it, you start noticing the bricked windows everywhere.